I'm Samantha Jones, a career officer who worked her way up from a no-name recruit to commanding troops downrange. For years, I covered for my brother, lent money, drove hours to help, and kept the peace at home. But when my parents blocked me at his graduation, deadbeats aren't allowed in, I made a choice that changed everything. Ever been sidelined or humiliated by someone you poured yourself into? Share your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I dive in, tell me where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries and reclaiming your worth. What happened next might surprise you. Growing up, my brother Jake and I were inseparable in the way only siblings 18 months apart could be. He was the charming one, quick with jokes and easy smiles that made adults light up when he walked into a room. I was the steady one, the one who remembered his lunch money when he forgot it, who covered for him when he snuck out to meet friends, who helped him with homework he'd procrastinated until the last minute. Our parents noticed the difference early. Jake got praise for his natural charisma, while I got expectations for my reliability. The pattern started small. When Jake needed a ride to soccer practice, I was the one who biked there to pick him up when Dad was too busy. When he wanted to quit piano lessons, I was the one who convinced our parents to let him try guitar instead, then helped him practice scales when his enthusiasm waned. When he got into trouble at school for talking back to teachers, I was the one who smoothed things over, explaining to our parents that he was just expressing himself and needed understanding, not punishment. My parents ate it up. They loved having a daughter who made their lives easier, who anticipated problems before they became crises. But they loved having a son who made them laugh even more. Jake could charm his way out of any situation, and they seemed to find his mischief endearing rather than troublesome. When report cards came home, Jake's C's were celebrated as improvements while my A's were expected. When Jake made the JV football team, it was a family celebration. When I made varsity debate team as a sophomore, Dad asked if that meant I'd be home less to help with dinner. The imbalance became more pronounced as we got older. Jake struggled with his first job at the grocery store, showing up late and calling in sick whenever he had weekend plans. I covered his shifts twice when he begged me to, knowing he needed the money but couldn't bring himself to be responsible about earning it. When he was short on rent for his first apartment, I lent him $300 I'd saved from my part-time job. When he totaled his car driving home drunk from a party, I drove him everywhere for 2 months while he figured out what to do next. Through it all, I told myself this was what family did. We supported each other. We had each other's backs. The fact that support seemed to flow primarily in one direction didn't bother me much, or at least I convinced myself it didn't. Jake was my little brother. He needed me. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I believed that loyalty and sacrifice would be remembered and appreciated when it mattered most. My parents' favoritism became more obvious as Jake and I entered our 20s. They bragged about his promotion to shift supervisor at the warehouse, where he'd finally found steady work. They proudly told neighbors about his new girlfriend, about the apartment he'd decorated himself, about his plans to maybe go back to school someday. When I mentioned my acceptance to officer candidate school, they nodded politely and asked if that meant I'd be moving away. When I called to tell them I'd graduated third in my class, Mom said that was nice and then spent 20 minutes telling me about Jake's latest camping trip. The military suited me in ways I hadn't expected. The structure, the clear expectations, the meritocracy of it all. Performance mattered more than personality. Results spoke louder than charm. I excelled in training, earned respect from my instructors, and found myself surrounded by people who valued competence and dedication. For the first time in my life, I was appreciated for who I was rather than what I could do for someone else. But even as I built a life and career separate from my family, I maintained my role as Jake's supportive big sister. When he called stressed about work drama, I listened and offered advice. When he needed help moving apartments, I took leave and drove 8 hours to help him pack and load boxes. When he decided to join the military himself, following my path in a way that surprised everyone including me, I helped him prepare for the ASVAB and connected him with recruiters I trusted. My parents were thrilled about Jake's decision to enlist. Suddenly, They were experts on military life, sharing articles about military families and talking proudly about having 2 children in service. But their pride remained distinctly unequal. Jake was their brave son who'd chosen to serve his country. I was their daughter who'd always been good at following rules and now happened to be in uniform too. When Jake graduated from basic training, they flew across the country to attend his ceremony. When I was promoted to lieutenant, they sent a card. The inequality stung, but I'd learned to manage my expectations. I focused on my career, my soldiers, my responsibilities. I earned commendations, led successful missions, built a reputation as someone who could be trusted with difficult assignments. My fellow officers knew my worth even if my family didn't seem to recognize it. That had to be enough. Jake and I stayed in touch through emails and occasional phone calls. He seemed to be thriving in his military environment, though he struggled with some of the same discipline issues that had plagued him in civilian life. He complained about rigid schedules, unfair sergeants, and regulations that didn't make sense to him. I listened without judgment, remembering my own adjustment period, and offered encouragement when he needed it. Despite everything, I was proud of him for sticking with it and making something of himself. As Jake progressed through his military career, our parents' commentary about both of us began to shift in ways that made me uncomfortable. They spoke about Jake's service with growing pride and specificity, recounting details about his training and assignments that they'd somehow never bothered to learn about mine. Meanwhile, their references to my career became increasingly dismissive, as if my years of service were somehow less significant than his more recent enlistment. When neighbors asked about their children, they led with Jake's military stories and mentioned me as an afterthought. I tried to rationalize their behavior, telling myself that Jake's military journey was newer and more exciting to them, that they were simply enjoying watching him grow into the discipline and responsibility that had always come naturally to me. But their obvious preference began to wear on me in ways I hadn't expected. After years of accepting their unequal treatment, I found myself caring more than I wanted to admit about their recognition and approval. The little girl who'd always tried to earn her parents' love through reliability and sacrifice was still there, still hoping to matter as much as her charming younger brother. As Jake approached graduation from his advanced training program, our parents' excitement reached new heights. They planned to attend his ceremony, booked flights and hotel rooms, and talked for weeks about how proud they were of their son the soldier. When I mentioned that I might attend as well, to support Jake and celebrate his achievement, their enthusiasm noticeably dimmed. They made vague comments about limited seating and wondered aloud whether it might be awkward for Jake to have his sister there on his special day. The message was clear. This was about Jake, not about family, and my presence would somehow diminish rather than enhance the occasion. For the first time, I began to wonder whether my years of unwavering support and loyalty had been as appreciated as I'd always assumed they were. Jake's graduation day arrived with the crisp efficiency that marked all military ceremonies. I'd driven 6 hours to reach the base, taking leave I'd planned to use for a long overdue vacation. Despite my parents' lukewarm response to my attendance, I wanted to be there for my brother. Whatever complications existed in our family dynamics, Jake had worked hard to reach this milestone, and I believed he deserved family support on his big day. The ceremony was scheduled for 10 in the morning, with families gathering beforehand outside the main hall. I arrived early, wearing my dress uniform out of respect for the occasion and the traditions we both now served. I expected to find my parents waiting near the entrance, probably taking photos and chatting nervously with other military families about their pride and anticipation. Instead, I spotted them near the main doors, speaking intently with each other in the way that suggested tension rather than excitement. My father wore his best suit, the one he'd bought for Jake's high school graduation, and my mother had chosen a navy blue dress with the small American flag pin she'd started wearing after Jake enlisted. They looked like proud military parents, which made what happened next even more jarring. As I approached them with a smile, expecting hugs and shared excitement about Jake's achievement, my mother noticed me first. Her expression didn't light up with recognition and welcome. Instead, it hardened into something I'd never seen directed at me before, cold and dismissive in a way that stopped me mid-step. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. I blinked, confused by her tone and the question itself. "I'm here for Jake's graduation. I told you I was coming." My father turned then, and his expression matched my mother's. "We told you this was family only," he said, as if I'd violated some clear boundary rather than simply showing up to support my brother. "I am family," I replied, still not understanding the hostility I was encountering. "Jake's my brother." That's when my mother stepped directly in front of me, physically blocking my path toward the entrance. "Deadbeats aren't allowed in," she said, her voice loud enough that other families nearby turned to look. "Go home." The words hit me like a physical blow. Deadbeat. The term seemed to hang in the air between us, absurd and cruel and completely disconnected from reality. I stared at my mother, searching her face for any sign that she was joking or had somehow mistaken me for someone else. But her expression remained fixed, almost triumphant, as if she'd been waiting for this opportunity to say exactly what she thought of me. My father nodded in agreement, crossing his arms and making it clear that they presented a united front. "This is Jake's day," he said. "He doesn't need you here taking attention away from his achievement." Around us, other military families continued their preparations for the ceremony, but I could feel their curious glances and whispered speculations about the drama unfolding near the entrance. The public nature of the humiliation made it exponentially worse. This wasn't a private family argument that could be resolved behind closed doors. This was a deliberate, public rejection of my place in the family, performed for an audience of strangers who would remember the woman in uniform being turned away by her own parents. I opened my mouth to respond, to defend myself or argue my case, but the words wouldn't come. Years of accepting second place, of making excuses for their favoritism, of telling myself that family loyalty mattered more than fair treatment, had left me unprepared for this level of cruelty. I stood there in my dress uniform, with my ribbons and insignia representing years of service and sacrifice, being called a deadbeat by the people who were supposed to love and support me unconditionally. The irony was crushing. I was the one who'd helped Jake prepare for military life, who'd answered his panicked calls during basic training, who'd encouraged him through every difficult phase of his service. I was the one with the established military career, the leadership experience, the record of achievement and dedication. And yet somehow, in my parents' narrative, I was the deadbeat who didn't deserve to witness my own brother's graduation. For a moment, I considered pushing past them, asserting my right to be there as Jake's sister and as a fellow service member. But the weight of their rejection, the public nature of their dismissal, and the growing attention from other families made that impossible. Instead, I took a step back, then another, watching as satisfaction spread across my parents' faces. They had succeeded in erasing me from Jake's moment, in making it clear that I was not welcome in my own family celebration. As I walked away from the entrance, my face burning with shame and confusion, I could hear my mother's voice behind me, bright and cheerful as she greeted another military family. The contrast was devastating. She could summon warmth and pride for strangers, but had nothing but coldness for her own daughter. The realization that this wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment, but a deliberate choice settled over me like a weight I'd never felt before. I made it to my car before the tears started, sitting in the parking lot of what should have been one of the proudest days of my brother's life, wondering how I'd become the villain in my own family story. The 30 minutes I spent sitting in my car felt like hours. I watched other military families walk past toward the ceremony hall, their faces bright with anticipation and pride. Some wore military uniforms like mine, parents or siblings who'd served alongside the graduates they'd come to celebrate. Others wore civilian clothes, but carried themselves with the particular dignity that seemed to come with military families, understanding the significance of the moment their loved one was about to experience. I should have driven away then. I should have started the 6-hour trip home, processed what had happened, and figured out how to move forward with the knowledge that my parents viewed me as unwelcome at family celebrations. Instead, I found myself thinking about Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, my commanding officer during my second deployment. She'd once told me that respect wasn't something you could demand or inherit, it was something you earned through your actions, and something that others recognized whether they wanted to or not. The thought of Martinez reminded me of who I'd become outside my family's influence. In the military, I wasn't the overlooked older sister or the reliable backup plan. I was Commander Jones, someone who'd led soldiers through difficult missions, who'd earned commendations for leadership under pressure, who'd built a reputation for competence and integrity. My fellow officers knew my worth because they'd seen it demonstrated repeatedly in situations that mattered. That recognition hadn't come easily or accidentally. It had come through years of training, deployment, sacrifice, and steady performance in roles that demanded everything I could give. I'd missed holidays and family gatherings for training exercises and overseas assignments. I'd spent months away from home, leading soldiers through challenges that tested every aspect of our preparation and character. I'd made decisions that affected people's lives and safety, had earned the trust of superiors and subordinates alike through consistent demonstration of judgment and capability. Yet somehow, none of that mattered to my parents. To them, I remained the same person I'd been at 18, reliable, useful when needed, but ultimately less important than Jake's needs and achievements. They couldn't see past their long-established family dynamics to recognize who I'd actually become. Or perhaps they could see it, but resented it, preferring the version of me that existed primarily to support their golden child rather than the version that had built an independent life and career. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this moment had been building for years. My parents' increasing dismissal of my achievements, their obvious preference for Jake's military stories over mine, their suggestion that I shouldn't attend his graduation, none of it had been accidental or thoughtless. They'd been systematically erasing me from the family narrative, rewriting history to position Jake as the family's military success story and me as an irrelevant footnote. But Lieutenant Colonel Martinez's words echoed in my mind. Respect was something others recognized whether they wanted to or not. My parents might refuse to acknowledge my achievements, but that didn't make those achievements less real. The soldiers I'd led knew who I was. The officers I'd served alongside knew what I was capable of. The institution I'd dedicated my career to knew my value, even if my family chose not to see it. I looked up at the ceremony hall, where Jake's graduation was probably beginning. Inside, my parents were no doubt beaming with pride, taking photos and videos, collecting congratulations from other families about their son's achievement. They were experiencing exactly the kind of moment I'd imagined we might share as a family, the recognition and celebration that comes with military milestones. But they'd chosen to experience it without me, had actively excluded me from a moment that should have belonged to all of us. The decision I made then surprised me. Instead of driving away, I got out of my car and walked back toward the ceremony hall. Not because I thought my parents had changed their minds or because I expected a warm welcome, but because I realized something important. I didn't need their permission to be proud of my own service or to honor the institution we both served. I wasn't going back for them or even for Jake. I was going back for myself, for the years of dedication and sacrifice that had earned me a place in that hall regardless of what my family thought about it. As I approached the entrance again, I saw my parents still positioned near the doors, scanning the crowd and chatting with other families. They looked confident and satisfied, as if they'd successfully handled an unpleasant situation and could now focus on enjoying their son's special day. The sight of them made my stomach clench, but I didn't stop walking. For once in my life, I was going to prioritize my own dignity over their comfort. That's when I heard the first voice call out behind me. "Commander Jones?" The ceremony had just concluded, and graduates were beginning to file out of the hall in formation. I turned to see Private Rodriguez, a young soldier I'd mentored during my last assignment, breaking into a smile of recognition and surprise. "Commander Jones, I didn't know you were going to be here," he said, his voice carrying the genuine warmth of someone encountering an unexpected but welcome familiar face. Before I could respond, another voice joined in. "Is that Commander Jones?" Sergeant Williams, someone I'd served alongside in Afghanistan, was approaching with the kind of grin that suggested he was genuinely happy to see me. Then something extraordinary happened. As word spread through the formation that I was there, soldiers began turning to look in my direction. Some I recognized from various assignments and deployments. Others I didn't know personally, but who seemed to know me by reputation. What started as a few individual greetings quickly became something much more significant. "Commander Jones," Sergeant Williams called out, his voice now carrying the tone of formal military recognition rather than casual greeting. "It's an honor, ma'am." That's when the first soldier saluted. Within seconds, the gesture spread through the formation like a wave. Graduates who'd just completed their own ceremony, soldiers from various units who'd attended to support friends and family members, even some of the instructors and staff, they turned in my direction and rendered the crisp, respectful salute that the military reserves for moments of genuine honor and recognition. The hall fell silent except for the sound of 500 people acknowledging my presence with the highest form of military respect. I stood there, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the gesture, as an entire formation of soldiers demonstrated their recognition of my service and leadership. This wasn't politeness or protocol. This was genuine respect from people who understood exactly what military service meant and who chose to honor mine publicly. I returned the salute, my hand steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm me. As I did, I caught sight of my parents in my peripheral vision. They stood frozen near the entrance, their faces cycling through confusion, shock, and something approaching horror as they realized that their deadbeat daughter was being honored by an entire military formation. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Then the soldiers began to break formation, some approaching me directly to shake hands or share brief words of recognition, others simply nodding respectfully as they passed. The normal post-ceremony bustle resumed, but with an undercurrent of awareness that something significant had just occurred. My parents remained motionless, their earlier confidence and satisfaction replaced by obvious bewilderment. They watched as soldier after soldier stopped to speak with me, to express recognition or share memories of service together. They witnessed the deference and respect these men and women showed me, the clear indication that I held a position of honor and authority in a world they'd never bothered to understand. And somewhere in that formation, Jake stood in his dress blues, watching as his entire graduation ceremony was suddenly recontextualized by his sister's unexpected recognition. The aftermath of the salute unfolded in slow motion. My parents stood exactly where they'd been when they blocked my entrance, but their expressions had transformed completely. The confident superiority they'd worn while calling me a deadbeat had been replaced by confusion and something approaching panic as they tried to process what they'd just witnessed. Other military families had noticed the unusual display of respect, and I could see them pointing discreetly in my direction, whispering questions about who I was and why an entire formation had chosen to honor me. The contrast between their evident curiosity about my identity and my parents' obvious discomfort at my recognition couldn't have been starker. My mother was the first to attempt damage control. She approached me with a forced smile, speaking in the artificially bright voice she used when she was trying to manage social situations. "Samantha, sweetheart, what a surprise to see you here after all." The casual use of my name and endearment, delivered as if the confrontation at the entrance had never happened, was breathtaking in its audacity. She was attempting to rewrite the events of 30 minutes earlier, to pretend that she'd never called me a deadbeat or blocked my entry to my brother's graduation. I looked at her steadily, not returning her forced smile. "Hello, Mother." My father joined her, his own expression uncomfortable but determined. "We didn't realize you were so well known here," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the soldiers who continued to nod respectfully as they passed us. The understatement was almost laughable. They hadn't realized I was well known because they'd never bothered to learn about my military career beyond the basic facts. They knew I was an officer, but they'd never asked about my assignments, my responsibilities, or my reputation within the military community. They'd been content to view my service as something I did rather than something I'd excelled at. "There's a lot you don't know about my career," I replied calmly. Before either of them could respond, Jake appeared beside us in his dress blues, his face a mixture of pride in his own achievement and obvious discomfort at the tension surrounding his family. He looked between my parents and me, clearly trying to understand what had happened and how to navigate the awkward situation. "Samantha, I'm glad you came," he said, and I could hear genuine gratitude in his voice despite the circumstances. "Congratulations, Jake. You've earned this," I replied, meaning it sincerely despite everything that had occurred. My parents exchanged glances, and I could see them struggling to maintain their narrative in the face of evidence that contradicted everything they'd assumed about my place in the military hierarchy. Other families continued to approach me with recognition and respect, making it impossible for them to dismiss what had happened as some kind of misunderstanding or exaggeration. "We should probably get some photos," my mother said, her voice still artificially cheerful as she tried to steer the conversation toward normal family celebration activities. But Jake was looking at me with something approaching awe. "Samantha, how do you know all these people?" "I mean, I knew you were an officer, but I've served with many of them," I explained simply. "Others know me by reputation." The military community is smaller than you might think, especially among those who've deployed multiple times. The word deployed seemed to hit Jake differently than it had before. For the first time, he appeared to be considering what my years of service had actually entailed, the experiences and responsibilities that had shaped my military career while he was still finding his footing in civilian life. My parents, however, remained focused on managing the situation rather than understanding it. They maneuvered themselves into position for photos, attempting to create the appearance of normal family celebration despite the tension that hung over all of us. But their discomfort was obvious, and their earlier confidence had been completely undermined by the recognition I'd received. As we stood together for awkward family photos, I realized that this moment had fundamentally changed the dynamic between us. My parents could no longer dismiss my military service as insignificant or treat me as an afterthought in the family narrative. They'd been forced to confront evidence of my achievements and reputation, witnessed by hundreds of people who clearly held me in high regard. But rather than prompting genuine recognition or apology, their response was to minimize and manage, to find ways to incorporate this new information into their existing worldview without fundamentally challenging their assumptions about me. They seemed more concerned with saving face than with acknowledging how wrong they'd been about their own daughter. The weeks following Jake's graduation were marked by a strange silence from my parents. No phone calls to process what had happened, no acknowledgement of their behavior at the ceremony, no questions about my military career that might help them understand the recognition I'd received. Instead, they seemed to retreat into their established patterns, as if ignoring the incident might make its implications disappear. When they did contact me, it was with the same casual dismissal they'd always shown my achievements. My mother called to tell me about Jake's new assignment, spending 20 minutes detailing his housing arrangements and social opportunities. When I mentioned my own upcoming promotion board, she made polite noises and quickly changed the subject back to Jake's experiences. Their denial was so complete that I began to wonder if they'd somehow convinced themselves that the salute hadn't really been the significant gesture of respect it had clearly been. Perhaps they'd decided it was protocol or politeness rather than genuine recognition, a way to maintain their narrative without confronting uncomfortable truths about their treatment of me. But word of the ceremony had spread beyond that single day. Other military families who'd witnessed the event had shared the story, and my reputation within the broader military community had been enhanced rather than diminished by the public display of respect. Colleagues who heard about it expressed pride in serving alongside me, reinforcing that my peers understood exactly what that moment had represented. Jake, however, seemed genuinely affected by what he'd witnessed. He began calling more frequently, asking questions about my deployments and assignments that he'd never shown interest in before. His tone was different too, less casual, more respectful, as if he was finally beginning to understand that his big sister was someone deserving of recognition in her own right rather than simply a supportive figure in his life. "I had no idea about Afghanistan," he said during one of our calls. "I mean, I knew you'd deployed, but I didn't know about the leadership commendation or the mission you led in Kandahar." "You never asked," I replied, not unkindly but honestly. There was a pause on his end of the line. "I should have asked. I should have understood what you were doing while I was figuring out my own life." The admission was more than my parents had ever offered, and it represented a shift in Jake's perspective that gave me hope for our relationship. He was beginning to see me as someone with my own achievements and experiences rather than simply as his supportive older sister who existed to help smooth his path through life. Our conversations began to feel more balanced, with Jake asking about my work and experiences rather than simply updating me on his own life. He expressed genuine interest in my leadership responsibilities, my deployment experiences, and the challenges I'd faced in my career. For the first time, I felt like he saw me as a whole person rather than just his helpful sister. My parents, however, remained entrenched in their established patterns. They continued to focus their attention and praise on Jake, while treating my achievements as background information barely worth acknowledging. When relatives asked about their children, they led with Jake's military stories and mentioned me as an afterthought, just as they'd always done. The difference was that now other people were beginning to notice the disparity. Extended family members who'd heard about the graduation ceremony expressed confusion about my parents' failure to celebrate my military career with the same enthusiasm they showed for Jake's. Friends and neighbors who learned about my rank and service record seemed surprised by my parents' casual dismissal of my achievements. Slowly, my parents were being forced to confront the fact that their assessment of their children didn't align with how others viewed us. The social pressure wasn't dramatic or confrontational, but it was persistent and impossible to ignore completely. People expected them to be proud of both their military children, and their obvious preference for Jake's achievements over mine was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain publicly. Still, they resisted any fundamental change in their perspective. When forced to acknowledge my success, they did so in ways that minimized its significance or suggested it had somehow come easily to me. They seemed incapable of admitting that they'd been wrong about me for so many years, preferring to maintain their established narrative rather than confront uncomfortable truths about their favoritism and neglect. The distance between us grew as I realized that their recognition would never come, or would only come in forms so grudging and incomplete that it would feel worse than no recognition at all. I began to understand that I'd been seeking validation from people who were fundamentally incapable of providing it, at least not in any form that would satisfy the daughter who'd spent decades trying to earn their love and respect. 3 years after Jake's graduation, I received orders for a prestigious assignment to the Pentagon, a position that represented significant recognition of my capabilities and potential for advancement. When I called to share the news with my parents, my mother's response was characteristic. Polite acknowledgement followed immediately by a detailed update about Jake's recent promotion and his girlfriend's new job. The contrast was so stark and so familiar that I found myself laughing. Not with humor, but with the kind of recognition that comes when you finally see a pattern clearly enough to predict its every iteration. My parents would never change, would never see me as anything other than the reliable background figure in Jake's story. The salute at his graduation had forced them to confront evidence of my achievements, but it hadn't changed their fundamental perspective on who mattered in our family. That realization was both liberating and sad. Liberating because it freed me from the exhausting cycle of hoping for recognition that would never come in any meaningful form. Sad because it meant accepting that my parents were incapable of the kind of growth and acknowledgement that might have repaired our relationship. But Jake had continued to evolve in his understanding of our family dynamics. He called to congratulate me on the Pentagon assignment with genuine enthusiasm, asking detailed questions about my new responsibilities and expressing pride in my advancement. He'd begun to see the pattern in our parents' treatment of us, and while he didn't directly confront them about it, he made efforts to ensure that my achievements were acknowledged and celebrated within our family. "They don't get it," he said during one conversation about our parents' latest display of favoritism. "I don't think they ever will. But I get it now, and I'm sorry it took me so long to understand what you've been dealing with." His recognition meant more to me than I'd expected. While I'd learned to find validation in my career and among my colleagues, having my brother finally see and acknowledge the disparity in our parents' treatment provided a different kind of healing. We began to build a relationship based on mutual respect rather than the old dynamic where I provided support and he accepted it as his due. My parents continued their established patterns, seemingly unable or unwilling to examine their own behavior critically enough to change it. They remained focused on Jake's career and life while treating mine as pleasant background information. When Jake was featured in his base newspaper for a community service project, they framed the article and sent copies to relatives. When I received a commendation for my work on a significant military policy initiative, they mentioned it briefly in conversation and moved on to other topics. The disparity had become so obvious that even Jake began to feel uncomfortable with their overt favoritism. During family gatherings, he made deliberate efforts to redirect conversations toward my achievements and experiences, trying to balance the attention in ways that highlighted their neglect of me. His efforts were appreciated, but they also emphasized how abnormal our family dynamic had become. I realized that my parents' inability to recognize my achievements said more about their limitations than about my worth. They'd constructed a family narrative that cast Jake as the star and me as the supporting character, and they seemed incapable of revising that story even when presented with overwhelming evidence that it didn't reflect reality. Their rigidity wasn't really about me. It was about their need to maintain a worldview that made sense to them, even when it required ignoring facts that contradicted their assumptions. As I prepared for my Pentagon assignment, I felt a sense of closure about my relationship with my parents. I'd spent decades hoping they would see and appreciate who I'd become, but I finally understood that their recognition wasn't necessary for my success or happiness. The people who mattered, my colleagues, my soldiers, my brother, and most importantly, myself, knew my worth. That was enough. The Pentagon assignment exceeded all my expectations. Working at the highest levels of military planning and policy gave me opportunities to contribute to decisions that affected thousands of service members and their families. My colleagues were brilliant, dedicated professionals who valued competence and results above personality or politics. The environment was demanding but rewarding, pushing me to grow in ways I hadn't anticipated. During my second year at the Pentagon, I was selected for a joint task force addressing military family support systems. The irony wasn't lost on me that someone whose own family had never quite figured out how to support her military career was now helping develop policies to better support military families nationwide. But perhaps my experience gave me insight into the challenges that military families faced when they didn't understand or appreciate the sacrifices inherent in military service. The work was meaningful and visible, leading to recognition from senior military leadership and civilian defense officials. When I briefed the Secretary of Defense on our task force recommendations, I felt the satisfaction of knowing that years of experience and dedication had prepared me for exactly this kind of responsibility. The 18-year-old who'd enlisted seeking structure and purpose had evolved into someone trusted with significant institutional responsibilities. My parents' response to these achievements remained predictably muted. When I mentioned the task force assignment, they nodded politely and asked if it meant I'd be working longer hours. When I described briefing senior Pentagon leadership, they seemed more concerned about whether I was eating regularly and getting enough sleep than about the professional significance of the opportunity. Jake, however, had become genuinely interested in my career progression. He asked thoughtful questions about my work, expressed pride in my accomplishments, and began sharing news of my achievements with his own military colleagues. The brother who'd once taken my support for granted had evolved into someone who actively celebrated my success and made sure others knew about it too. "I tell people about your Pentagon assignment all the time," he said during one of our regular phone calls. "Most of them are impressed before they even meet you. It's kind of cool having a sister who briefs generals." His pride meant more to me than our parents' approval would have. Jake's recognition came from understanding what military service actually required, what leadership responsibilities entailed, and what it meant to advance to positions of significant responsibility within the military hierarchy. His appreciation was informed by experience rather than family obligation, making it more genuine and valuable. Our relationship had transformed into something I'd never expected but deeply appreciated. Instead of the old dynamic where I provided guidance and support while he accepted it passively, we now had conversations where he sought my professional advice, and I asked for his perspective on leadership challenges I was facing. He developed into a competent, thoughtful soldier whose insights were genuinely valuable. During family gatherings, Jake continued to redirect attention toward my achievements when our parents focused exclusively on his life and career. He'd bring up my Pentagon work, ask me to explain policy initiatives I was involved in, and generally make sure that I wasn't relegated to the background role our parents seemed to prefer for me. His efforts highlighted just how unbalanced our parents' treatment had always been. My parents seemed bewildered by Jake's obvious respect for my career and his insistence on discussing my achievements alongside his own. They appeared to view it as unnecessary politeness rather than genuine recognition, unable to understand why he thought my work deserved equal attention. Their confusion was almost as telling as their original favoritism had been. The distance between my parents and me continued to grow, but it no longer felt painful in the way it once had. I'd found validation and purpose in my career, respect among my colleagues, and genuine appreciation from my brother. Their inability to see my worth had become their limitation rather than my burden. I no longer needed their recognition to feel successful or valued. When I was promoted to colonel, 5 years after Jake's graduation ceremony, my parents' response was characteristically lukewarm. They congratulated me politely and quickly moved the conversation to Jake's recent assignment to a base in Germany, spending 20 minutes discussing his housing situation and travel opportunities while glossing over the significance of my promotion to field grade officer. Jake's reaction was entirely different. He called me separately to express genuine excitement about my promotion, asking detailed questions about my new responsibilities and the selection process. He understood that achieving colonel rank represented years of demonstrated leadership and performance, that it placed me among a select group of officers trusted with significant command responsibilities. "Do you realize how few people make colonel?" he asked during our conversation. "I've been telling everyone at my unit about my sister, the colonel. People are impressed, Samantha. Really impressed." His enthusiasm stood in stark contrast to our parents' casual acknowledgement. The difference highlighted something I'd come to understand about recognition and respect. It meant the most when it came from people who truly understood what they were recognizing. Jake's military experience had taught him to appreciate the significance of advancement and achievement in ways our parents never would. The promotion ceremony was held at the Pentagon, with senior officers and colleagues who'd worked alongside me for years. It was a moment of professional validation that felt earned through decades of service, deployment, and leadership. My commanding officer spoke about my contributions to military policy and my reputation as someone who could be trusted with complex, high-stakes responsibilities. My parents attended, flying in for the ceremony with the same dutiful obligation they'd shown for other family milestones. They took photos and smiled appropriately, but their presence felt more like social courtesy than genuine celebration. They seemed more impressed by the Pentagon building itself than by the significance of what was happening to their daughter within its walls. Jake couldn't attend due to his overseas assignment, but he arranged for flowers to be delivered to my office with a note that said, "Proud of you, sis. You've earned this and so much more." The gesture meant more to me than my parents' physical presence, because it came from someone who understood what the moment represented. After the ceremony, as we walked through the Pentagon corridors, my parents seemed awed by the building and the obvious respect my colleagues showed me. They watched as senior officers stopped to congratulate me, as staff members addressed me with the deference due my rank, as my peers expressed genuine enthusiasm about my promotion. For the first time, they appeared to grasp that their daughter held a position of real authority and responsibility within an institution they'd never bothered to understand. But even then, their response was to minimize rather than celebrate. At dinner that evening, my mother commented that I must work with very nice people who were so polite to me, as if the respect I'd been shown was social courtesy rather than professional recognition. My father suggested that I was lucky to have found a career where I fit in so well, as if my success was accidental rather than earned. Their inability to recognize achievement when it was demonstrated so clearly wasn't surprising anymore, but it was definitive. I realized that they would never be capable of seeing me as someone deserving of recognition and pride. They could witness evidence of my success, watch others celebrate my achievements, and still maintain their narrative that I was somehow less significant than Jake. The realization was freeing in ways I hadn't expected. For decades, I'd shaped my decisions partly around the hope of eventually earning their recognition and approval. I'd maintained relationships and made sacrifices based on family loyalty that was never reciprocated. Understanding that their acknowledgement would never come in any meaningful form released me from obligations that had never been as mutual as I'd believed. Jake continued to thrive in his military career, and our relationship deepened as we both matured into roles that demanded leadership and responsibility. He developed into someone I genuinely respected, not just as a brother, but as a fellow officer whose judgment and integrity had been tested and proven. Our conversations became exchanges between equals rather than the old dynamic of guidance flowing primarily from me to him. "I've been thinking about that day at my graduation," he said during one of our calls. "About what Mom and Dad said to you and how wrong they were. I should have said something then, but I didn't understand what was happening." His acknowledgement of that day meant more than any apology from our parents would have. Jake had been there, had witnessed their cruelty, and had evolved enough to recognize it for what it was. His growth and understanding provided a different kind of validation than I'd been seeking from our parents. My career continued to advance, with assignments that utilized my experience and reputation within the military community. I led initiatives that improved military readiness, developed policies that affected thousands of service members, and earned recognition from civilian and military leadership alike. The success felt clean and earned, based on merit rather than family dynamics or personal relationships. Our parents aged into grandparenthood when Jake married and started a family, and their focus shifted to his children with the same intensity they'd once devoted to his achievements. They became doting grandparents who traveled across the country to attend school plays and birthday parties, lavishing attention on Jake's family while maintaining their casual relationship with me. I found myself genuinely happy for Jake's family life and my parents' joy in their grandchildren, without feeling excluded or diminished by their obvious devotion. The little girl who'd once competed for their attention and approval had grown into someone who found fulfillment in her own achievements and relationships. Their love and pride were clearly reserved for Jake's branch of the family, but that no longer felt like a rejection of my worth. When I retired from the military after 25 years of service, the ceremony was attended by colleagues, subordinates, and superiors who'd worked alongside me throughout my career. Speaker after speaker described my contributions to military readiness, my leadership during deployments, and my influence on policy that would affect the military for years to come. It was a celebration of a career built on dedication, competence, and service to something larger than myself. My parents attended my retirement ceremony with the same dutiful obligation they'd shown for my colonel promotion. They seemed proud in a general way, taking photos and accepting congratulations from my colleagues, but their pride felt distant and abstract. They were proud of having a daughter who'd achieved success, but they'd never bothered to understand what that success entailed or what it had cost me to achieve it. Jake, now stationed stateside, attended with his family. He spoke briefly at the ceremony, describing me as someone who'd always led by example, who'd shown him what dedication and integrity looked like long before he'd understood their value. His words carried weight because they came from someone who'd seen me at my best and worst, who'd benefited from my guidance and had grown to appreciate what it had meant. The contrast between Jake's informed appreciation and our parents' surface-level acknowledgement was striking but no longer painful. I'd learned to value recognition that came from understanding rather than obligation, from people who knew what they were celebrating rather than those who felt they should celebrate without knowing why. As I transitioned into civilian life, I reflected on the journey that had taken me from the 18-year-old seeking structure and purpose to the retired colonel who'd contributed meaningfully to an institution I respected. The path had been challenging, sometimes lonely, and occasionally marked by family dynamics that had tested my sense of worth and belonging. But it had also been deeply rewarding, filled with opportunities to lead, to serve, and to make a difference in ways that mattered. The recognition I'd found among my colleagues, the respect I'd earned from subordinates and superiors alike, and the satisfaction of work well done had provided validation that was more meaningful than family approval ever could have been. My relationship with my parents settled into a comfortable distance. We maintained contact, celebrated major holidays together, and shared updates about our lives, but I no longer sought their recognition or approval. They continued to focus their attention and pride on Jake's family, and I genuinely didn't mind. Their limitations had become their problem rather than mine. Jake and I built a relationship based on mutual respect and genuine affection. We talked regularly, sought each other's advice on professional and personal matters, and maintained the kind of sibling bond I'd always hoped we might develop. He'd grown into someone I was proud to call my brother, not just because of family obligation, but because of who he'd become as a person and leader. Years later, when people asked about my military career or my family relationships, I could speak honestly about both the challenges and rewards of each. I'd learned that respect and recognition were most valuable when they came from people who understood what they were acknowledging, and that family relationships were strongest when they were built on mutual understanding rather than obligation or favoritism. The woman who'd once stood outside her brother's graduation ceremony, called a deadbeat by her own parents, had built a life of purpose, achievement, and genuine relationships. The salute from 500 soldiers had been a moment of public recognition, but the real victory had been learning to value herself independently of others' approval, to find fulfillment in work that mattered, and to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than family dynamics. I never forgot the lesson of that day. You are not defined by who blocks you at the door, but by who salutes when you walk through it. The people whose recognition mattered most were those who understood what they were recognizing, and their acknowledgement was worth more than approval from those who could never see your true worth. In the end, that understanding had made all the difference in building a life I was proud to call my own. 10 years after my retirement, I received an unexpected call from the Pentagon. The Secretary of Defense was hosting a ceremony to honor veterans who'd made significant contributions to military policy and readiness. My work on the Family Support Task Force had been selected for special recognition, and they wanted me to attend as one of 12 distinguished honorees. The invitation felt surreal. After decades of military service and years of civilian life, I was being called back to receive recognition for work I'd done out of professional duty rather than any expectation of future acknowledgement. The ceremony would be attended by current military leadership, defense officials, and select family members of the honorees. I called Jake first, sharing the news with someone I knew would understand its significance. His response was immediate and enthusiastic, expressing pride not just in the recognition, but in the work that had earned it. He'd followed my post-military career and understood how the policies I'd helped develop had affected thousands of military families. "This is incredible, Samantha. Do you realize how rare this kind of recognition is? They're basically saying your work changed how the military supports families. That's a legacy." His words carried weight because they came from someone still serving, someone who'd seen firsthand how policy changes affected real soldiers and their families. Jake's perspective helped me understand that this recognition wasn't just ceremonial. It represented acknowledgement that my contributions had lasting impact. When I called my parents to share the news, their response followed familiar patterns. They congratulated me politely, asked a few surface-level questions about the ceremony, and then shifted the conversation to Jake's upcoming promotion board and his oldest daughter's high school graduation. Their inability to grasp the significance of the honor no longer surprised or hurt me, but it provided stark contrast to Jake's informed enthusiasm. The ceremony took place in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, surrounded by portraits of Medal of Honor recipients and displays honoring military valor throughout American history. Standing in that space, wearing my dress blues one final time, I felt the weight of tradition and service that had shaped my adult life. The Secretary of Defense spoke about each honoree's contributions, describing how our work had strengthened military readiness and improved the lives of service members and their families. When he reached my name, He detailed how the family support policies I'd helped develop had reduced deployment stress, improved retention rates, and created resources that thousands of military families relied upon. Colonel Jones understood that military strength comes not just from individual soldiers, but from the families who support them, he said. Her work ensured that those families received the support they deserved, strengthening the entire military community. Sitting in the audience, I watched my parents as they heard their daughter's achievements described in terms they'd never bothered to learn. They looked proud but distant, as if they were hearing about a stranger's accomplishments rather than understanding what their own daughter had contributed to something larger than herself. Jake had flown in for the ceremony, bringing his teenage daughter, who was considering military service herself. As the secretary spoke about my work, I saw Jake lean over to explain to his daughter what the recognition meant, helping her understand that her aunt had influenced policies that would affect her own potential military career. The generational impact of that moment, my work potentially benefiting my own niece, added unexpected emotional weight to the ceremony. After the formal presentations, other honorees and their families mingled in the reception area. I found myself in conversations with current military leadership who knew my work by reputation, with defense officials who'd implemented policies I'd helped develop, and with younger officers who'd benefited from programs I'd contributed to creating. My parents stood somewhat apart from these conversations, clearly out of their element among people who spoke fluently about military policy and institutional change. They seemed more comfortable taking photos than engaging with the substance of why we were all there. Their distance from the military world I'd inhabited for decades was more obvious than ever. Jake, however, moved easily through the reception, introducing his daughter to senior officers and explaining how the various honorees had contributed to military excellence. He'd grown into someone who could navigate these professional environments confidently, and watching him helped me appreciate how far he'd come from the young man who'd once struggled with military discipline. During a quiet moment, Jake's daughter approached me with questions about military leadership and the challenges of balancing service with family life. Her interest was genuine and informed, shaped by growing up in a military family that understood both the demands and rewards of service. Talking with her reminded me of conversations I'd had with young soldiers throughout my career, moments when experience could be passed to the next generation. "Dad talks about you all the time," she said. "He says you showed him what it meant to serve with integrity. I hope I can do something that meaningful with my life." Her words carried echo of the recognition I'd sought from my parents for decades, but had found instead among people who understood the value of service and sacrifice. This young woman, shaped by Jake's evolved understanding of what military service meant, could see value in my career that my parents had never recognized. As the ceremony concluded, I realized that this recognition represented more than personal achievement. It demonstrated how individual contributions could ripple through institutions and generations, affecting people I'd never met and policies that would outlast my own career. The work I'd done out of professional duty had created lasting change that would benefit military families for years to come. The drive home with my parents was quiet, marked by their typical pattern of polite acknowledgement followed by discussion of more familiar topics. They seemed glad to have attended but remained fundamentally disconnected from what the ceremony had represented. Their pride was general and distant, based on social recognition rather than understanding of substance. Jake called that evening, his voice full of enthusiasm about the ceremony and pride in what I'd accomplished. We talked for an hour about the other honorees, the significance of the recognition, and what it meant for my legacy within the military community. His appreciation was informed and specific, based on understanding what military policy work entailed and how difficult it was to create lasting institutional change. "I keep thinking about what you've built," he said. "Not just your career, but the actual impact you've had on how the military operates. That's going to affect soldiers and families for decades. It's incredible." His recognition felt complete in ways our parents' acknowledgement never could. Jake understood both the personal cost of military service and the institutional value of policy work. He could appreciate what I'd sacrificed to achieve these contributions and why they mattered beyond personal achievement. Looking back on the ceremony and its aftermath, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with family dynamics or long-sought parental approval. The recognition had come from people who understood what they were acknowledging, who could appreciate both the work itself and its broader impact. It represented validation from the institution I'd served and the colleagues who'd witnessed my contributions firsthand. My parents would never understand what I'd accomplished or why it mattered, but that limitation belonged to them rather than diminishing my achievements. The daughter they dismissed as a deadbeat had built a career that influenced military policy and improved thousands of lives. Their inability to see that value said everything about their perspective and nothing about the worth of what I'd contributed. The ceremony reinforced everything I'd learned about recognition and respect over the decades since Jake's graduation. The salute from 500 soldiers had been a moment of public acknowledgement, but this recognition represented something deeper: institutional appreciation for sustained contribution to something larger than personal achievement. Both moments shared the same essential quality. They came from people who understood what they were recognizing and why it mattered. 3 months after the Pentagon ceremony, my parents' perspective finally shifted in a way I hadn't expected. Jake's daughter had written a school report about military service, focusing on her aunt's career and policy contributions. She'd interviewed current soldiers about how family support programs had helped them, contacted military families who'd benefited from resources I'd helped create, and researched the broader impact of the policies I'd worked on. When she presented her project at a school assembly, my parents attended as proud grandparents. But instead of hearing general praise for their granddaughter's work, they listened as she detailed specific ways her aunt had influenced military life. She quoted soldiers who credited family support programs with helping them through deployments, cited statistics about improved retention rates, and described policy changes that had affected thousands of military families. For the first time, my parents heard someone explain my career accomplishments in terms they could understand, not through military jargon or institutional recognition, but through human stories about real families helped by work I'd contributed to. Their granddaughter's presentation translated my abstract policy work into concrete examples of lives improved and problems solved. Jake called me afterward, his voice carrying an emotion I hadn't heard before. "Mom and Dad finally get it, Samantha. Really get it." After listening to Emma's presentation, Dad turned to me and said, "I had no idea Samantha helped so many people." Mom was quiet for the whole drive home. That evening, my mother called me for the first time in months. Her voice was different, uncertain rather than casual, as if she was navigating unfamiliar territory. "Samantha, I wanted to tell you that Emma's presentation was beautiful. I never understood what your work actually meant for other families." The admission was small but significant. She wasn't offering the comprehensive acknowledgement or apology that might have healed decades of dismissal, but she was recognizing that she'd failed to understand something important about her own daughter's life and work. It was more honesty about her limitations than I'd ever heard from her. My father remained characteristically silent on the subject, but Jake reported that he'd asked detailed questions about my career during their next conversation, showing genuine curiosity about work he'd never bothered to learn about before. Their evolution was gradual and incomplete, but it represented movement in a direction I'd stopped expecting years earlier. The change in my parents' understanding didn't alter our relationship dramatically, but it removed some of the tension that had marked our interactions for decades. They stopped dismissing my achievements quite so casually and occasionally asked questions that suggested genuine interest rather than polite obligation. It wasn't the recognition I'd once craved, but it was acknowledgement that they'd been wrong about something fundamental. Most importantly, their shift came too late to matter in the ways it once would have. I'd built a life based on professional achievement, meaningful relationships, and personal satisfaction rather than family approval. Their belated recognition was pleasant but unnecessary, confirming rather than creating my sense of worth and accomplishment. The woman who'd once stood outside her brother's graduation ceremony, dismissed as a deadbeat by people who should have known better, had built something lasting and meaningful. The salute from 500 soldiers had been vindication in the moment, but the real victory was the life I'd created afterward, one defined by service, achievement, and relationships built on mutual respect rather than family obligation. And that's how a moment meant to push me out became the one that defined my worth on my own terms. Have you ever been underestimated by the very people who should have supported you? How did you handle it? Drop your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. If this resonated, hit that like button, subscribe for more stories about respect and resilience, and share this with someone who needs the reminder that loyalty and sacrifice don't make you a deadbeat, they make you stronger.